Well, welcome back, everyone. And today we're on week 3 of our back to school series where we get to talk about summer. I was just saying how this might be one of the last days above 70 degrees that we'll have for the remainder of the year, maybe until next year. The sun is shining though. I'm drinking rosé because I feel like it's my last opportunity to really embrace and enjoy that, even though I do drink rosé all through the winter and all through the year, as you should as well. But today we're going to get into what happened just after flowering. So we kind of left off last week at the flowering period, the very crucial yet kind of boring to look at process in the vineyard. And at this point, flowers are becoming fruit. We have fruit set, and then we're going to go all the way through Veraison when the grapes start changing, and then we look towards harvest into the fall. So again, back to our vine growing calendar. At this point in the year, we're over here in July, August, September, kind of depending on where you are. Harvest happens in September most of the time. We're harvesting plenty in October as well, so you can kind of move the circle upwards a little bit. But we're still in summer months. So talking about Veraison, we'll talk about different thinning passes and other things to make sure we're concentrating the best growing energy into these grapes. So first up is fruit set, which, like I said, we're just past flowering. So once all those flowers are fertilized, they turn into these tiny little berries, which you can see in this picture. Only about 30%, sometimes upward of 50% of flowers will successfully develop into berries, and that's in ideal conditions. So already when you do see how many clusters or how many flowers are out there in the vineyard, already you're not going to be getting all of that turned into fruit. That's just sort of a natural part of the plant. And you can see here that some of those brown spots, those are those little hats that lifted off in order for the flower to pollinate. Those will still hang around sometimes. Hopefully they all get knocked off at some point. When you do have those hats and they get stuck inside the cluster, sometimes they can cause issues. But that usually happens naturally. And the flowering phase is, like we talked about before, is what paused that rapid growth period when we had, almost inches of growth per day on the shoots. That whole first part of the spring has this huge rapid growth, and then it sort of pauses during flowering. And then right after flowering happens and fruit sets, and we get those tiny little berries, it starts right up again. So now we're into another rapid growth part of the vineyard year. And the vine is beginning to devote energy on both vegetative and reproductive strategies. So we're developing these fruits, these berries, but also still growing our shoots up and increasing our canopy and getting enough leaves for photosynthesis and all the things we need in order to ripen grapes. Now, what happens when we have issues with fruit set or issues with flowering? And I kind of mentioned this last week as well, the idea of shatter or colure. This is when we might get poor weather, some wind events, some rain events, or cold, and flowering can be affected. And you can see that picture on the left. That's kind of what it looks like when you have a cluster with a lot of shatter, where most of the, if we think about 30 to 50% of things flowering, that's more like 15% maybe of all the flowers actually becoming fruits. There's certain varieties that are more susceptible to this. Merlot is one of them, which we have here on property. I don't know I actually think this is a Cabernet Franc vine, but Merlot, Malbec, Grenache, there's certain varieties that just tend to have a little more shatter than others. Again, it's when the flowers fail to pollinate, and they'll basically just fall off the cluster and not produce fruit. This won't affect your quality per se. It will affect your yields, obviously, because you get less fruit on a cluster or on a vine. But the quality can still be great from the remaining berries. But it also will affect your cluster architecture, because now it's a lot looser. There could be more air movement, which could be a good thing. But it just kind of changes the prospect of that cluster. And then the other main fruit set issue that we sometimes have is millerandage. So another French word which causes berries to ripen unevenly. So the picture on the right is, I believe that this is actually a Malbec cluster. We have just one small row of Malbec in our lower vineyard. And that's another, again, it's a variety that's more susceptible to millerandage. Same with Grenache, same with Zinfandel, Gewürztraminer. There's other varieties that have this. And this is basically when berries are ripening unevenly. So it can result from, again, poor weather during flowering. There's also a boron deficiency that can cause this. And what it does is it prevents grapes from developing seeds. Or maybe it develops only one seed inside instead of two or three, based on the variety. So all those little green berries you can see were just seedless little berries that ripen or that set way after the other ones. Again, this affects your yields because you're not getting as much full ripe berries and as much juice as you would get. But again, not necessarily quality. The only caveat with that is that it is important that when you do get a cluster like this, if you decide to harvest this, that it is sorted, whether that's on a sorting table. Maybe this cluster is picked and they decide, it's really not worth putting the whole thing through a destemmer, and so they'll toss the whole cluster away. But those decisions will happen at different times, both through the growing season, through different passes, which we'll talk about both today and next week, through harvest decisions, and in the cellar during cluster sorting and crush activities. So then we're going to talk a bunch about berry growth today. So now that we have some fruit set, what's happening inside the grape? What's happening to turn this tiny little hard green berry into something delicious and something that we can make great wine out of? And you can break it down into 3 different phases of berry growth: stage 1, stage 2, and 3. The first stage is, again, we're back to this rapid growth. So we had rapid shoot growth from between bud burst and flowering, and then it sort of lagged a little bit. Then we have rapid growth again, which is usually now the seeds are being developed inside each of the berries. We have rapid cellular division and enlargement. So both cells dividing is causing the grape to get bigger, and enlargement through water is causing the size to grow. This is also when the berry is starting to accumulate different acids, phenolics, which will be tannins, not anthocyanins yet, but tannins and other flavonols that are providing different flavor and structure to the wine, and then different flavor precursors like pyrazines, that green taste that you can get in wine, green bell pepper. We'll talk about that in a second as well. And that usually happens, it's roughly 50 days. So it says 40 to 60 days, but about 50 days after fruit set, we get to stage 2, which is the lag phase. And this is right before Veraison. So this is at a point where the berries have reached now what they will think is 50% of the final size of each berry. The seeds begin to harden, or at least they begin that process. They won't fully harden until stage 3. And then at this point, the tannin and acid level has reached its maximum level. So, and for acids, that means it's at its lowest pH level. And then I put here next to the berries reached 50% of their final size. Now, you can use this to determine your final yields. So if you think of the vineyard as a business and you're thinking about, you have this product now, at every point that we can, if we can get an idea of how much fruit we're going to be getting at the end of the year, in order to know, we were just talking about this, how many fermenters are we going to need? How many bins will we need to send to the vineyard to pick the fruit and have them in fruit bins? How much space on a truck are we going to need based on yields to get it over to the winery? Even as far as how many barrels do we need? Do we need to order any other barrels to be able to put all of this fruit in? There's a lot of economic decisions that happen based on your yields and predicting what your yields will be. And so one of the things you can do during rapid growth, during stage 1, is really just get an idea of how many clusters are in your vineyard. So you might go through, even though they're still very small, you can count, like you can basically take a vine and count how many clusters per vine and get an average, and then do the math to sort of figure out how many clusters in your entire vineyard. But then it's really when you get to this lag phase, stage 2, that you can actually start to predict what your final yields will be in terms of weight. And it's because that more often than not, at lag phase, right before Veraison, they're 50% of their final size. So in this case, you can basically pick 100 clusters during lag phase. You can weigh them, and then you can basically, figure out what your cluster is. So divide by 100, you get your cluster weight, and then times by 2 to get what your eventual yields will be. Obviously, this is not an exact science. There's people say it's kind of like the dark arts of yields guessing, but it's a great way to start getting an idea of how much crop you'll have at the end of the year. It's also good to let you know moving forward in some of the passes you'll be doing over the next couple of months, how much fruit to drop during thinning, whether that's more leaf thinning and green harvesting or green cluster drop, or a color pass, which is closer to harvest, where you go through and maybe remove clusters, kind of like that mille rondage, where there might be a bunch of green still on a cluster. And you want to know how much fruit can I actually drop per vine or per row based on what our yield estimate is. So long explanation, but basically lag phase is kind of boring because not much is happening, but it is a good opportunity to start calculating and seeing what your final crop will be looking like. And then we get to stage 3, which is the ripening growth. So this is basically that rapid growth resumes, it renews. Veraison sort of marks the beginning of this stage, which is where the colors of the grapes now are changing from green into purple or red or a yellowish green. Again, this is the growth at this point is happening primarily now through cell enlargement. So there's no more cell division. The grape has figured out what it is. It has the cells it needs, but now it'll start increasing based on water and sugars and other things accumulating into the grape. And so sugars are rapidly accelerating while acid levels is starting to go down and tannins will start to decrease. There's 2 different kinds of acid. Actually, we'll talk about this in the next slide because it'll be a little easier to visualize it. And then lastly, other flavors or flavor precursors are also accumulating, like we had talked about before, as pyrazines or other green notes. So this is sort of a visual representation of what we just talked about, which I think this graph is pretty great, just so you can see what's happening and all the things that are affected during this growing phase. So your berry size is increasing, going up and down. You have your days from flowering, so 0 all the way through till harvest time down here. And then you can kind of see the 3 phases. You have this rapid growth from really hard green berries all the way up through here to this lag phase where there's not much growth, things sort of stall for a little bit all the way through. And then we have the stage 3 again, where more is happening and the grapes are turning color after veraison. The xylem, phloem, it's been a while since I took a science class. This week was very science heavy for me, so I had to go back and figure out what all these things meant. But basically, the xylem and phloem are both vascular tissues in plants in general. Xylem is responsible for sending water up from the roots into the plant or into the fruits, whereas the phloem can work both ways. It basically can send sugars and other nutrients in and out. But the xylem is water and minerals, and phloem is where sugars are being passed from leaves during photosynthesis into the grape. So you can see it's really important to have enough water here. This is why we're irrigating this whole time to make sure there's enough water to grow to help this rapid growth in the berry. But then basically that sort of stops, and during your stage 3, the phloem takes over because it's trying to accumulate sugars, which is the most important part of this side. Down here, speaking of sugar, there's also this Brix table or Brix line on the bottom, so you get an idea that even at veraison, there's already some sugars accumulated. You definitely can't taste it. This year I've been tasting berries all throughout this period just to get an idea of what it tastes like. What do berries taste like when it's 20 days on and they're really tart and green? It's not great. What does it taste like during lag phase? It's not great. And even though there might be 4, 5, 6 degrees Brix, so like just a tiny bit of sugar here, there's also so much acid and so much tannin. It's so bitter. It's just not great at all. It's really not until you get to about 18, 19 Brix that grapes will really start tasting pretty nice. In fact, 18, most Vitis vinifera varieties are picked anywhere from 20 to 25, 26 degrees Brix. Again, this is a measurement of solids in the wine, but mainly sugar. That 20, even 22 to 25, the lower side for white wines, the higher side for reds, is pretty standard. If you're making sparkling wine, though, say you want to pick Pinot Noir or or Pinot Meunier or Chardonnay, anything to make sparkling wine, they're usually harvesting right around 18 bricks, which can be tricky because sometimes at 18 bricks, you still have some Veraison, you still have some green berries and clusters, and it can be a really tricky time. Lastly on this, and you can see too, this is just a great way to think about it, berry formation in stage 1 and then berry ripening, which we kind of already covered. And then this gray bar here I think is pretty interesting because it's showing you some of those other acids and flavor precursors that are happening and at which point in the process are they being generated. The main two acids, I sort of talked about acid buildup in grapes, are tartaric acid or tartrates here on the left, and then malic acid or malate. And we'll talk more about malic acid next week when we do just a brief sort of in the cellar part of the harvest or the fall class. But malic acid is your super tart. Think of malic as green apple. It's your green apple acid. And that's, for the first part of the phase, there's a lot of malic acid. But then right at Veraison, malic acid starts being basically converted into sugar. So there's a process, I forget the name, it's a long neogenesis, something like that, where malic acid is being converted into glucose, so into sugar, whereas tartaric acid or tartrates are basically a byproduct of sugar accumulation or of sugar synthesis. So both tartaric acid and malic acid get higher as you go into Veraison, and then after that, malic acid starts dropping immediately because it's being consumed, whereas tartaric acid is actually increasing, but because there's more and more sugars and more water, the final acidity is diluted, so it's still overall acidity is going down, even though there might be more tartaric acid than malic acid. I just found that kind of fascinating because I always thought that all the acids just start dwindling, but tartaric acid actually increases. The more sugar you get, the more tartaric acid you get. I think that's all for this. This is another attempt at me doing a little time-lapse video. So I found one post at the end of one of our Cabernet rows and try to take a picture every couple of days, every week or so that you can see kind of this process of grapes growing. And then it's cool too when it pauses here because you see, oh, they're purple, they're big, and then zoom, they go right back down. So this very early on, June 2nd. Remember, we were flowering at the end of May, mid to end of May, depending on the blocks. This is actually the block that we still haven't harvested yet. So September 23rd is the last picture here. And you can see that it's basically gone through Veraison by September 23rd, but there's still a few berries that are kind of pinkish. So those are still on the vine. They look great now. I haven't got an updated picture, but that is a little more delayed than some of our other blocks that have already been harvested or have already gone through Veraison. And speaking of Veraison, this is just some more details about this start. So again, this is the beginning of stage 3 of growth. Typically about 4 to 6 weeks after flowering. The word, I tried looking up, an exact meaning of the word of Veraison, and it literally just means the change of color of the grape berries, which is clunky at best. And so we used a French term, Veraison, because it's sort of the best term for it. But again, this is when those harder green berries are transforming into softer purple or translucent yellow-green berries if they're from white wines, and done by cell enlargement rather than cell division. And at this point too is when we think about the canopy or the vegetative growth. By Veraison, shoots are typically at their full height. So they stop growing at this time, again, that the vine transitions into focusing all of its energy into the grape ripening, into that reproductive cycle. It's also another crucial time for weather and other events. There's still a lot of research being done, I think I've said this multiple times, of how smoke affects grapes. I know we're all dealing with a little more smoke right now with some of the other fires in Washington. Luckily, it's not really hitting us or affecting us nearly bad enough to be worried about it. But around Veraison is when smoke taint can be the most penetrating, when the skins are still developing, they're still changing. And so I don't want to get too much into it because it's still, I don't even know if I'd be able to give you the most correct information. But just so you know, that's another reason why Veraison is very crucial. And then just to look inside the berry for now, so you get an idea of where different things are happening there's the skins, or that the peripheral zone. I think this I kind of like the diagram on the right more than the diagram on the left. But the idea that you sort of have these three zones. There's the skin, or the exocarp is what they call it, the intermediate zone, or mesocarp, which is mostly just where the sugar and water is held, and then the central zone, or the endocarp, which is where the seeds are and protection around the seeds, which again is where some sugar and those harsher malic acids are. The peripheral zone, I think, is the most interesting because this is where we're getting a lot of the aromas and flavors and things that will translate into the actual wine. If you think about sugar and water, or pulp or juice or bulk, is really just giving you the liquid of the wine. If you just had sugar, which is what yeast will consume in order to make alcohol, and you had water, which gives you the volume so that you can have a bottle of wine and not just a drop of wine, it'd be kind of boring. And then, of course, you have acid, so you have a little brightness or tartness. But in the skins and right under the skin, in all the vascular bundles and peripheral areas, is where you get all these other things, the phenolics like tannin molecules and anthocyanins, which is what gives it color. You have you still have some sugar and acidity, but then you also get all these other flavor compounds like terpenes, monoterpenes, which can give you some floral aromas, or you can have TDN, which is trimethyl di something, I forget the name of it, but it's what in Riesling, what makes Riesling maybe smell like kerosene or waxy or slaty. And it can be really intriguing. There's all these different flavor compounds that sort of exist in that outer layer. And that's what makes wine exciting. And we'll talk about that more actually on field trip, but I'll get to that later as well. So the other thing at this time, so berries are ripening, but how can we assist in that? One way is by our canopy management. So hopefully our shoots are at their max, or their highest level, by Veraison. This is a picture of our Merlot block, our lower block of Merlot, which had been kind of behind schedule. Again, this vintage, a lot of things were behind schedule. It was a little wet and cool earlier on in the year, and then we had a lot of heat in the summer, which slowed things down. But this is one of the things you can do is, first of all, there's a thinning pass, and usually the thinning pass and raising trellising wires are happening at the same time. So that you can see in the corner of the picture on the bottom, there's some leaves and other shoots and things on the bottom. So they are removing extra leaf growth, and you sort of think about suckering again any other leaves or vegetative stuff popping out from trunks or from the base or underneath the cordon. And that's one part that's important. But the other thing is allowing enough sun to get on these grapes to help with ripening. Sunlight and heat is what helps accumulate sugars and a lot of those flavor compounds and anthocyanins and other things like that. You need sun and heat in order to do that. And so earlier in the season, there'll be these wires that are up down below. And at this point, after those canes have sort of grown and the weight of the leaves and the grapes will cause them to wilt sideways, that you can raise those trellising wires into a vertical position. Now this is usually only done actually on one side. So even in this picture, this is facing west, so the sun is behind me and rising in the east and getting that nice morning light and morning sun. But they actually only raise the wires on this side. On the other side of the plant, there's still a little bit of shade, because by the time the sun gets over into the afternoon heat, that's when it's the most intense, especially when we were dealing with a lot of days over 100 degrees. You want that extra canopy shade on the afternoon side of the rows, whereas you want all that nice morning sunlight and heat on the east side. So that's kind of just to explain the orientation of this picture. In general, though, this was, like I said, Merlot was struggling, it was behind as far as ripening. We wanted to help that out. When you don't have to worry as much about that, you can also choose to keep a fuller canopy or to keep more shade on your fruits. There's a lot of different, that can completely be determined by variety. It can change based on your soil, your microclimate. There's lots of different factors that will affect why you choose to do your canopy a certain way. And obviously weather too, is how hot is it getting? But there's all these ideal canopy situations that looked up. It's something like, ideally you want 14 to 16 leaves per cluster on your vine. And then you also want the canopy, you want perfectly dappled sunlight. They talk a lot about dappled sunlight, where you have some sunlight hitting clusters, but other parts of the cluster might be shaded. And the way they measure that is using a stick. I wrote it down and I want to remember what the actual term, it's called the leaf layer number. And it's basically if you take a stick and push it through the canopy, you want to make sure that the stick's only touching two or less leaves to get all the way through, that you don't have too many leaves. You can see here that there's quite a bit of leaves above, but this is more in the fruiting zone, in that lower part where all the clusters are. So just another interesting way to measure how your canopy is developing. And then lastly, canopies are also super important for transpiration, or that evaporative cooling during the hottest parts of the summer, which helps keep the temperature down in that fruiting zone during heat waves. Because when we talk about heat, this summer we had, I forget the numbers, over 20 days of over 100-degree weather out here. And when the temperature of the grapevines or that fruit reaches 94 degrees, the vine will shut down and it goes into survival mode. So photosynthesis stops, all vegetative growth, grape ripening will cease, everything stops because it protects itself. But that transpiration or that evaporative cooling can help protect the grapes so that even when it's over 100 degrees, I think I read somewhere it's 104 is really when the vine shuts down, because there's enough evaporative cooling to keep the grapes at that 94 degree or below 94 degree temperature with your canopy. Irrigation during this time is also crucial to prevent soil evaporation, because some of your water is going to be evaporating from the soil before it can even get into the plant. And so you want to provide enough water to the plants, but also to that whole zone, so that there's enough to cool or for the plant to use in transpiration. And then the other thing that's really helped us with heat waves out here is the natural diurnal shift here on Red Mountain. So it's a phenomenon all throughout Eastern Washington. And it's one of the reasons why grapes grow so well here, is that we have such a huge shift or a swing from daytime temperatures to nighttime temperatures, where sometimes it's 40, 50. I remember one day where it was over 100, I think it was 105 or something during the day, and it got down to 61, I think, at night. So it's incredible how different that can be, but that will help the vine cool off. It helps retain acidity even during the hottest parts, where maybe the berries are starting to lose acid because it's getting too ripe or too hot. So that's another just crucial part of being out here in Eastern Washington. So let's check in quickly about our new blocks, the Annex Block and Block 4. So this picture on the left is the Annex Block, where we finally have those vines in the ground, and we've added irrigation tubes. And then we're also going to talk about grow tubes on the right. This is in Block 4, in the middle of them, setting up grow tubes. So grow tubes, there's a whole bunch of different styles and different kinds of grow tubes you can do or get. Some of them are cylindrical or round, some are shaped like a triangle, some have a slit in it so you can open and take it around and then take it off. Ours are more square or rectangle shaped, and it does a bunch of things that are beneficial. So it's helping this initial season, this initial growth, to be upright and to establish our eventual trunk. It also helps provide extra water through just condensation. So when we do have water, when those leaves start transpiration and there's evaporative cooling, all that water can kind of condense on the sides of it, drip back down, and then we have extra water for the plant when it needs it. It also, I think I mentioned this before, that it makes any herbicide applications or weed control passes a lot safer, because it'll help protect those vines as you're trying to control all this other stuff, this weeds around. It helps protect from any animals that are interested in chewing on the leaves or any sort of intense wind desiccation. And then, and this is obviously push this down so you can see the process. So there's a bamboo stick that they just stick in the ground right next to it. You can see the little vine right here. It's just a little guy, but that's what we want to protect. So he's opening up the grow tube, and it's just basically cardboard or a piece of cardboard-ish paper. Punches the holes to fit it around the bamboo, and then he'll slowly put it down and tuck in all the leaves on the cutting into the tube. And so these will be here through the whole season. And then pretty soon, I just talked to Justin today, one of our vineyard managers, and asked him this because you're supposed to remove them before the winter, especially in cooler places where you don't want, where you want both of the vine to adjust to the cold early, you want it to acclimate and prepare for cold hardiness, and then you don't want the trunk to be too exposed before it's hardened. Or I'm not saying that right. Basically, yeah, you want to remove it so that the vine has a chance to harden and prepare itself, because it might stay too warm, because there's also kind of a little greenhouse effect that'll keep it warm inside. But what we're going to do is basically lift it off the ground before winter, and so that'll prevent any cold air from settling that could be damaging to the vine when it's this young. But again, that also helps expose it to cooler air earlier before it gets way too cold, in hardening and preparing for winter. And then the other stuff that was happening recently was just other infrastructure. We had end posts installed. So that's what this Bobcat's doing, is drilling down these holes for some of the end posts for when we put in our eventual wire trellising system. We got all the irrigation lines laid for both block 4 and the annex block. And then we had grow tubes installed on annex block as well. And basically we're just looking towards the winter when we will go through to do that pruning pass, but also trellising wires will be installed, and you'll start to see the vines take shape into the eventual cordon trained vines that we have now on property. And then these are just the last little pictures. So this was recent. I forget the date of this picture, but you can see all those vines have popped out of the top of the grow tubes here. And then these are two of the pictures of our annex block. The one in the middle is looking back towards the ridge of Red Mountain and our winery way in the back there. So this is some Cab Franc and some Merlot. And then the lower part of the annex block, facing south again towards the Horse Heaven Hills, this is some Cabernet Sauvignon. But that's about it. So that was our summer class. Next week we get to talk all about harvest, maybe a little bit of what's happening in the cellar as well. And then Shelly and I met recently to talk more about our field trip, which we're getting so excited for. And these are just some of the things to look forward to. We're going to be doing, I've kind of saved talks about geology and soil. We're going to do a whole short little seminar on that when you're here, because I will be able to actually go see and touch the soil, and it might be a little more interesting when you have that experience when it's fresh. I'm looking forward to, we're going to do sort of a blind tasting, deductive tasting workshop, which will be interesting. And then Chris is actually going to be able to grab some of the estate wine samples that we have in barrel from 2021 and bring them with him when we do a tasting panel. So just little teasers to see what's coming up, but that's basically what's happening. So yeah, that is our summer class. I don't know if that I got really excited. I don't know. I got really excited learning about summer, just because, like, again, the closer you get to harvest, it just gets so exciting. When you see purple fruit, when you get to just walk through and taste berries all the time, it's just such an exciting thing. But yeah, didn't know if you guys had any questions pop up during that time.
You?
Yeah.
I have one. I'm just intrigued by those grow tubes you were talking about.
Yeah.
And I'm curious how light and air gets in, because it looked like the tube was going in, like when you drew a circle, I could barely see the vine, but it looked like it was way in the bottom of that tube. So how does light or air help it? I mean,
Yeah. Well, I think so. It's a good point, and actually there's a lot of research out there that also says that grow tubes there's also a lot of negative things about grow tubes. And one of them is, like, when you talk about air, or about because air movement is important to prevent fungus or there's certain things. And especially if it has this little greenhouse effect where you can have more moisture, that can be an issue. But the thing to remember about vines is, naturally, like, when vines out in the wild are, I forget the term, but they basically always grow upwards towards the sun. So vines in the wild you find in the middle of the forest, the reason it's a climber is because it's evolved to be a plant that can still grow in shade, because it's constantly trying to find any source of light it can. And so it'll prioritize that growth and prioritize going straight up because it needs to, not because it's we're not necessarily worried that it's not going to get enough nutrients or not enough sunlight because that the vine is pretty persistent in order to find it. Usually, to be fair though, there's some grow tubes out there. I was walking the other day that some of the little vines didn't make it, and that could be a bunch of different reasons. It could be something in the soil around then. It could be,
So
some.
follow up then with that, if you have one that's lost,
Mhm.
do you need to replace it in order to have a beautiful row?
Yeah, and I believe I would believe that that probably would happen next year because you can't really plant this late in the season. You usually want
Right.
to be planting in spring and summer,
Yep.
and so they'll probably when they go through and do their winter when they lift the grow tubes, which that'll happen soon. They're obviously very busy with with the harvest now, but the next time they're in the vineyard will be to do that, and I wonder if that's when they'll actually mark all the spots where they may need to plant again. But that happens all the time, and we'll see it when you're here too. That even throughout the old blocks, there's places where you'll see a much younger vine sort of
Yeah.
interspersed between the rest of them
Yeah.
because of certain things happening.
Cool.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Any other questions?
I'm curious about how much the color impacts the taste.
Mm, that's a good. That's a great question. I don't know how much. That's a great question. I don't know how much color impacts the taste, like the actual color molecules, the anthocyanin phenolics affect taste because they are more color. I mean, I know how it affects taste later in the bottle because that's the process. Like when a red wine ages, it's the anthocyanin molecules that bind to tannin molecules and then drop as sediment, and that's why wine will lose color, but also tannins and smooth out sort of over time. But I'm not quite sure. I know, in learning about tasting, I feel like I've heard some people talk about the amount of blue color versus red color in skins, but I
Well,
don't
even though you
know about it in terms of flavor.
you described, okay, so in this phase, they're going from the hard green to
Mhm.
the softer purple. It's obviously significant going from hard to soft in that journey. I just wondered, does color impact it at all? Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I might have to look up more about that um, because I really don't know. Yeah, and it's funny because it's like ringing a bell of as if I've heard someone talk about it before, and I can't remember
Mhm.
what sort of what came of that. But that's a good question. That's a great question.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Kind of related to maybe the color. Looking at the wine grape and that peripheral zone where you mentioned the flavor compounds, a lot of the flavor compounds are concentrated. I understand on Red Mountain, what makes the grapes so good is that because they're exposed to wind and sun and heat, and then the skins, I guess well, I don't know if this is the same thing. Where would that layer get thicker and therefore have more flavor concentration because of some adversity to the berry?
Yeah, no, I think you're right on. So that is one of the reasons why Red Mountain fruit has the structure it does, has the amount of tannin. Is because the skins are a little thicker, but also the berries are a little smaller. So it's one of the both of those happen a lot of times when you are in a really windy area, is it prevents the grapes from growing as much. And even that too, I don't know if it's necessarily because wind causes berries to just kind of like knock together, and even just the act of hitting each other can grow their skins tougher to protect themselves, or if it's because it's blowing dust into the berries, because that's another thing. I think dust can also hit skins and that it'll cause skins to grow thicker.
So
But in
actually the
general,
skin though is different than that peripheral layer though, right? Because the
most of it
skin
is
is the covering.
yeah, but most of it, especially when we take a berry and you just split it open, like you squish it in your fingers, it kind of naturally separates into the peripheral and to the
Oh, okay.
mesocarp. So when you like take a like skin of a grape berry, it's most the what's it called the endocarp, or the part of the this right under the skin layer is actually not that big, and I think that
Mhm.
diagram might even have exaggerated how much of
Yeah, it seemed to have it pretty big.
yeah, and I don't necessarily think that's as accurate, because it's mostly in the skins and just attached to the very underside. But you're right in that that's where really almost all of the flavor compounds, with the exception of pyrazine, so methoxypyrazines, which is that green bell pepper or
Mhm.
grassiness that you'll get in Sauvignon Blanc, Cabernet Franc, Cabernet Sauvignon. Those can also appear in the seeds and in and around the seeds as well. And it's one of the reasons why during winemaking you got to be really careful when you're doing punch downs or just how you're handling the caps, that you're not crushing those seeds, because it can release a lot of those pyrazines that you don't necessarily want. But in general, it's still the skin, that exocarp, that outer layer, is where 95% of all the flavor of wine comes from,
Okay.
for sure.
Speaking of punch downs, I always hear about it, like, are those always done manually or are there machines that do punch downs?
Yeah, there's a few different ways of doing punch downs, and a lot of it's based on how big your fermentation vessel is. A lot of this depending on how aggressive you want it to be or don't want it to be. So the way we've done it is all through manual punch downs. 'Cause our fermentation bins aren't that big, where you can sort of stand on the top of them, or even on a little step. Right now, I just stand on a stepping stool outside of it. Oh, there's a kitty. And then do punch downs by hand with a rake or a similar type tool. But there's a pump over system too. So in larger
Okay.
tanks, you can actually attach basically a hose to the bottom of the tank or near the bottom of the tank, and then pump water or pump wine from the bottom of it onto the top of the cap and splash basically the top. Because the important thing about cap management is keeping it wet. You don't want it to dry out, because then you can have some other off flavors and bacteria and other things
Oh, good
in
point.
the system.
Mhm.
But you also want to extract flavor. Because that's where all the skins are. That's where all the
They
flavor
float to the top.
down. Yep, all those skins have floated to the top, and so the punch downs with things is also trying to macerate and get a lot of those other flavors and tannins things out of the skins and kind of starting to break them down more. But when you have tanks that are like, floor to ceiling tall and some of these huge wineries, they don't really have they don't have the ability to take manual tools and do that. So pump over is one of the methods. There's also there's other auto vinifiers, or like there's auto pump things where they put it in and it kind of does a similar thing, almost like a fountain, where it takes wine from the inside and just kind of splashes it on top. Um, and then the other way too, you can just completely drain the tank and then pour the wine back on top of it. There's French terms for each of those ways of doing it. But yeah, a lot of it depends on how big the tank is. But then also, one of the reasons we love doing the punch downs by hand, and I always talk about it as being almost a more artisan way of doing it, is 'cause you can be a lot more careful, and you can be more aggressive when you want to be. So when we have each block, like say we have a Cabernet here, a Syrah here, and Merlot or something, maybe this Syrah we've decided we want to do an extended maceration or do a little more intense, punch down and everything. You'll go in and like really go to town and be a little more aggressive with it. Whereas you might be a little less aggressive with Merlot or something else or Pinot Noir, especially if you have Pinot Noir, it's a whole another delicate situation. And you'll want to be a lot lighter touch. So
Really interesting.
yeah. And I was thinking, because next week we're doing harvest and like fall time, which there's actually not much left in the vineyard to talk about other than, like color pass and then like picking the grapes. But then it's like, oh, then what happens? And so I might walk us through how the grapes are getting to the winery, and then those first steps, like what's happening during crush fermentation and all that. So we might talk a little bit more about that next week too.
Yeah, that would be fun.
So yeah. Oh.
She wants to be fed, that's all.
Oh, I'm sure my cat also wants to be fed. Any other questions about grape development or summertime in the vineyard? I'll tell you this, I'm still very excited about this vintage. Chris, our winemaker, seems very excited about the quality of this vintage too. Like, despite it being a little bit later, despite the heat problems we had, we luckily didn't have to deal with much smoke at all. That was never really an issue for us over here, which is great. And it's all happening at once, which is we'll talk about more next week as well. It's a very condensed harvest, but overall, we're just really excited about the quality this year.
So we talked about this, the shatter, the how do you say that? Couleur
Yeah, couleur, yeah, something like that.
and the Melarandage.
Hmm.
So you're talking about this summer and the quality of your experience. So it sounds like you didn't have much of either of those.
There was some, there was more shatter. I saw more shatter in the Cabernet Franc than in the Cabernet Sauvignon or other blocks. But even that, at the end of the day, like there's shatter happens all the time. It's pretty natural. And this is my first year here too, so I'm not sure if that's considered normal, like finding the things that I found. If that's like, oh yeah, that's that just happens. That's part of the like how the percentages work of what fruit you're actually going to get. But I didn't see a lot of Millerandage actually. Like that was when I saw that cluster. That's why I took a picture, because I was like, ooh, I found one, which is a good thing, because we didn't have to deal with that as much. But I also think because really like Grenache, Zinfandel, there's other varieties that are a lot more prone to it that we just don't grow here. And so I bet I would see more of it if I was in a different vineyard with different grapes.
Right.
Right.
You used the word, I wrote this down earlier, and I think this was in the same phase of the slide.
Mhm.
You talk about hats, and I didn't know what you meant by that.
Oh, yeah, it was during flowering. So the petals that are around each flower, the
Yeah.
way that it starts flowering process is that it sort of lifts, it fuses together, and they lift off each of the little pistils, each of the little joints, and
Yeah.
then it dries up and turns into this hat. And
Okay.
before it dries up, though, that's what drops the pollen onto each of the individual pistil or each individual flower.
So that's a good thing. You want it to.
So the hats are crucial, because you want them to lift off, and that's how we'll get a berry. But
Okay.
then normally, because it's dry, it'll sort of blow away or knock off or something else, which you want, because if too many of them stay, that's where it can mess with grape development or other things in the
You have
cluster.
shatter happening. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and shatter, and I'm not exactly sure actually how the hat uh, affects shatter, because shatter, um, it's a good question. I actually don't know if it's directly related to the hat, or just like if the pollen just doesn't get to the pistil. It's basically, yeah, something happened during that time,
Right.
whether a wind gust or a bird landed on the
Sure, that
branch.
makes sense too. Yeah.
Yeah,
Is
that
there
shake it off.
any influence of bees in? I've not heard a whole lot of talk about
So there's
insects
not,
or
partially because it's our hermaphroditic plant. It doesn't need pollination from bees.
pollinating. Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
and depending on, you'll want bees depending on your cover crop. So there are definitely vineyards that rely more on cover crop with
Uh-huh.
pea vines or vetch or other things that provide nitrogen, that you might want bees around to help pollinate those as part of that
You talked
system.
about that. Yeah, lavender and other.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, exactly. Or if you have other herbs and things planted, we have a lot of rose bushes actually at the end of some of our rows as well. And because roses are, and I actually don't know, bees aren't really involved in roses, are they?
Good question.
But anyway, there's definitely flowers around
so.
for other reasons, not directly related to
Yes.
vine growth. And
Yes.
then for sure, when you like talking about hedges down the road that are now biodynamic, in a biodynamic system, there's a lot more importance on having bees and a lot
Yes.
more biodiversity in your vineyard, not just vines, where bees can be
Yes.
crucial. But luckily vines don't have to rely on bees for pollination.
Nice. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Cool. Well, that was fun. I hope you all enjoyed that. I really enjoyed learning about all that stuff. But like I said, we'll start getting some more information, including an email from Shelly probably next week or so, asking about lunch options, because we're going to be ordering some lunches for you when you're here. We'll have a little more detailed itinerary about what to expect. I'll tell you right now, and we'll say this as well, make sure you pack for any types of weather, because it could be, well, a little cold, it could be warm. We're definitely going to be outside, because I would love for us to walk through the vineyard and get to some other parts of the property that to show you. So just think ahead as far as, I don't know, if you're doing laundry, making sure you have all the clothes you need for that. But yeah, we're so looking forward to having you all here. You'll get more info from us next week. And I guess I will see you next week. I'll have this video posted as well, hopefully next Monday, so you can watch it again. And I will find a way to get the PowerPoints for everyone and have them access.
That's good. I like
Thank
that.
you.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Awesome. Well, have a wonderful night, everyone. It was great to see you.
Thank you.
Great to
Thank
see
you.
everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks,
Yeah, bye.
Eli. It was great.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. It's awesome.
Bye.